So this morning, we are launching a new teaching series that we're going to focus on over June and July. You know, often we say, don't we, that church isn't a building, but it's not a test question, it's people, okay? Church is people. The Greek word that we translate the word church from in the scriptures is ecclesia, which means an assembly, a gathering. So there's this idea that we define church not as the building that we meet in or the building that we go to, but actually church is people. And so over the next few Sundays that we're going to be here, we want to kind of just put some definition around that idea of, you know, if church isn't a building, but if it's, as we said, it's people, then what are some of the things that characterize the church as the kind of gathered people of God? What are some of the things that characterize us? And I guess what we're doing as we do that, we're essentially saying that this is the kind of people we want to be, okay? You know, as we kind of lay the foundations for a brand new church in the city, this is the kind of people we want to be. So we're calling this series, This is Church. And to start with, I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of us being a generous church. Now, I'm sure we all have kind of different perspectives on what it means to be generous, or even what generosity looks like. And we've all had different experiences of that. And I think most of us would agree that generosity is realized when it is expressed or experienced. Okay? Simply talking about generosity like I am this morning doesn't really work. It isn't enough. We only truly know what generosity is through its expression or its experience. A little while ago now, I came across this story from the Cardiff Vineyard, and they received these Tesco shopping cards and a note in their offering. You might be able to read that, but it says this. It says, "Dear Sir and Madam, we are asylum seekers and are not sure how long we will remain in Cardiff. Whilst we are here, we've been provided accommodation as well as Tesco vouchers to buy food. As we do not have money, we are unable to pay our tithes and offerings in cash. Therefore, we would be grateful if you would receive our tithes and offerings in Tesco vouchers until we have money of our own. Sorry for the inconvenience. God bless. P.S. They work well at the tills." Now, that may be a simple expression of generosity, but for me, I think it captures something that we all experience, don't we, when we see generous acts take place. I remember a few years ago now, do you remember that? It's like an American TV show, Extreme Makeover. Like the house edition, not the kind of... You know, and they would literally bulldoze this family's house down and rebuild it. And they wouldn't hold back. And I know Disney were paying for it all. But, they would get all the mod cons. And, it would be like this dream house was built. And it's just this expression of generosity. And so when we see generosity, when we experience generosity, or when we see generosity expressed, even as simple as the one I've just highlighted, it does something to us all, doesn't it, internally? It does something, it stirs something, it provokes something in our hearts. The second thing is this: although generosity can be expressed through what we do monetarily, what we do with our money, the truth is generosity and being a generous church and a generous people is more than what we do with our money. Generosity is an orientation, it's a mode of being, it's a posture, and it's expressed at so many different levels. And then thirdly, generosity starts with God. The very essence of who God is one of exuberant generosity. And we don't have to look far to see that. Just look at creation. When God said, "Let the waters teem," with living creatures, he really meant it. There's currently a global initiative in place to find 100,000 unknown marine species over the next 10 years. This is in light of the fact that scientists believe there are 2.2 million marine species that exist in our oceans right now. And currently, we've only found 240,000 of them. In other words, there's stuff that God has created out of his creative generosity that none of us will ever see in our lifetime. That seems a bit extravagant, doesn't it? It seems a bit over the top. Like, why on earth would you do that? But that's the nature of God, who is this kind of creative being rooted in generosity. Not only is his generosity found in all that he creates, but he's generous towards you and me as well. He creates this amazing place for us to inhabit, then generously shares it with us. He gives mankind dominion. He tells us to go and subdue and rule the earth, rule his creation. And we're to partake in his generosity every moment of every day. And within that, we are all created, aren't we, in God's image. We're created in his image. And if God is a generous God, then we too, as his image bearers, are to be a generous people. So if you've got a Bible, why don't you turn to 2 Corinthians with me, chapter 8. And just to give us a little bit of context here, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he's encouraging them to sow generously, to not hold back. In fact, the next 2 chapters in 2 Corinthians is all about what we do with our generosity. And in doing this, he uses an example of another church. He talks about the church in Macedonia who had exhibited generosity, that had shown what generosity looks like. And so it says this. It says, "And now, brothers and sisters, I want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people, and they exceeded our expectation. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then, by the will of God, also to us. So we urge Titus, just as he had earlier made at the beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving." You see, being generous with our stuff, being generous with our time, with our energy, with our money, with our resources, isn't something that God just imposes upon us. But it's, as Paul says here, it's an act of grace. Generosity, according to this passage, is a gift of God's grace, something that we can possess, the grace of giving. And so as children, we are recipients, aren't we? We're recipients of God's grace. And God, by his grace, has changed the course of human history. And he's set us free from lives that have been enslaved to sin. And he's taken that punishment on himself. That's an expression of God's grace poured out upon us. And God, the only judge, has, by his grace, declared you and I innocent in his sight. And he's given us access to himself. And for those of us in a room like this who would call ourselves followers of Jesus, we are recipients of his grace. His grace has been poured upon us. And the Bible tells us that as recipients, we're not called to be containers. You know, we're not called to just be containers of his grace. Rather, we are designed to give his grace away. We're not meant to be like cul-de-sacs. I was riding my bike the other day. It's one of the ways that I'm trying to figure out where to be in Milton Keynes, you know, in terms of just like getting to know the city. And I went down this street and it's like, oh, it's another cul-de-sac. But you know, we're not called to be cul-de-sacs of grace or dead ends of grace. As if the grace of God ends with us. Rather, we're designed to be pipelines of God's grace. In other words, the grace that God pours upon us is meant to flow in us and through us to others, and not just end with us, but to benefit those around us. See, the Christian experience is an experience of the generosity of God, so that experience can be given away to others. We get to give. We get to give. We don't get to just keep it to ourselves. We get to give it away. And so Jesus teaches us about giving and generosity, and it flows out of this assumption that we have all been changed by God's grace. So our orientation towards stuff, our orientation towards our time, our energy, our resources, our attachment to things like money, they are different to the world around us. But being generous shouldn't be like an obligation or a burden. And being generous isn't, you know, some way that we kind of pay God back for being generous to us. Rather, being generous is good for us. It's good for you. Listen to these promises in Proverbs 11:24. It says, one person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Proverbs 22:9. The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Proverbs 28:7. Those who give to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them receive many curses. We're repeatedly told in scriptures to be generous, and that generosity is good for us. Acts 20:35, it says, the Lord Jesus himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. There's an author by the name of Stephen Post, and he wrote a book, I kid you not, it's called this, Why Good Things Happen to Good People, How to Live a Longer, Happier, Healthier, Happier Life by the Simple Act of Giving. A little bit of a mouthful, and it is on Amazon because I checked last night. But in his book, he cites a long list of scientific and widely accepted studies that point to the benefits of people who live out a lifestyle of giving and generosity. In his book, he quotes a study that took place with some preteens who were first surveyed in the 1920s. And they interviewed those that displayed generosity and a giving attitude. And as they grew up, they continued to monitor them. And what they found was that those who had a disposition towards generosity had lower rates of heart disease and depression in comparison to those who lived a slightly more selfish lifestyle. He also cites another study by Harvard University that shows that people's immune systems were strengthened by simply watching acts of kindness carried out by Mother Teresa, who lived a life of generosity and selflessness. He said that they've done MRIs on people and discovered that the parts of the brain that release kind of like feel-good chemicals light up when people think about giving and generosity. Hormone levels tied to compassion and peace rise when people experience generous behavior. In fact, they've done studies on people with wounds and found that people with wounds, their physical wounds, healed more quickly when they engaged in acts of giving. So being generous with our time, our energy, our resources is good for us. And nearly all world religions teach that it's good to be generous. And of course, not only is it good for us, but it's good for others, isn't it? When we are generous, other people are recipients of our generosity. And I'm sure every one of us in a room like this could tell a story of how someone's act of generosity has had a positive impact on our lives. So if being generous is who we are, and if being generous is not only good for us and good for other people, why don't we live more open-handedly? Why does it often feel hard? Well, one reason is because we live with generosity killers. We live, and it's not the person you live with. Don't look at them, okay? But we live with generosity killers. And the first of those would be debt and greed. It's true to say that as a nation, we are in debt. Outstanding personal debt in the UK stands at 1.28 trillion as of March this year. The average debt per household, not including a mortgage, rose last year by £8,500, so just over £34,500 per household. 58.7 million credit cards were issued to the UK residents as of January 2023, and approximately 9.4 million credit card transactions happen per day in this country. And at the same time as that, 280 people per day are declared insolvent or bankrupt. That's the equivalent to one person every 5 minutes, every single day. And then add to that an inflated economy and, food prices going up every single week. And as a nation, the reality is that we are a nation in debt. And we're in debt to our eyeballs. And the truth is, a culture that encourages us to use tomorrow's money to pay for today's lifestyle robs our ability to live generously. Let me say that again. A culture that encourages us to use tomorrow's money to pay for today's lifestyle robs our ability to live generously. But not only is generosity killed by debt and greed, but it's also killed by worry and fear. And especially in moments where things that we normally put our trust in start to feel shaken. You know, the kind of economic and political climate of our country, combined with the after effects of a global pandemic, have produced this drastic level of instability in our midst, hasn't it? We all kind of feel it at different levels. And in times of uncertainty and unrest like this, our ability to be generous with who we are and what we have is challenging. It becomes challenging, doesn't it? It becomes a little bit harder to think, I've got to live generously in the midst of this. And why is that? Why do we feel that way? Well, for one, our ability to be generous is always linked to our sense of what we trust and where we find our security. And if our inclination in a climate that we're now living in is to pull back from being generous, then I guess one question we could ask ourselves is, who or what are we trusting in? And in a culture crisis like the one that we're experiencing now, I would say the normal human response is to have worry and fear. That's normal, isn't it? That is a normal expression of the climate we currently find ourselves in. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? Will I have enough? Is my family's future secure? Those are normal concerns for us to have at a time like this. They are normal things for us to carry. Yet Jesus says this in Matthew 6:25. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And he goes on in verse 31. So do not worry, saying, what shall I eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Jesus is saying, as God's children who are recipients of his grace, we are no longer like those around us. The goal and orientation of our lives has changed. We're no longer running after the things that others run after, which generally is more things and more stuff. We don't have to hold on to stuff so tightly. Instead, as God's children, we're called to represent him to the rest of the world, especially in a time like this. And he is a generous God, and so therefore we are called to be a generous people. The reality is that God isn't in heaven thinking, oh, myself, the UK is in economic crisis. What on earth am I going to do? You see, in the midst of economic uncertainty, God is still in control. Do we believe that? Do we believe that in the midst of a cost of living crisis, that God is still in control? And see, it's in moments like this we need to remember where our citizenship is. That we're citizens of God's kingdom. And that our identity, our security, our provision comes from our heavenly Father. And when we fully realize that, when we fully embrace that, then maybe we would realize this isn't just the season to pull back, and somehow tighten the belt, as it were. But maybe this is the season to lean in. And so when the temptation is to close our hands, maybe the invitation of the Lord is to reopen them and to begin to think and live generously. Jesus goes on in verse 34. He says, therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. It's also important to note that I think Jesus is not opposed to planning and planning for the future. Planning is not worrying, and Jesus is not opposed to investing for the future. And investing is not worrying. Planning and investing for your family and your own financial future should be encouraged. In fact, there are many, many verses that we haven't got time to look at this morning that encourage us to not only plan for our future, but for our children and our children's children. And so it's good to plan, to save, to think about your kids' future and your dare I say it, your own retirement. I was just thinking who's nearest. Planning, saving, investing, they're all good things. But there's one thing that is bad, and Jesus says that's worry. Worry is bad. Now, we could dismiss Jesus' command here and just say, well, he's just unrealistic. Jesus is just being unrealistic. It's wishful thinking. He really doesn't know what an economic crisis feels like. But we need to remember that Jesus faced his own troubles. He didn't live this trouble-free existence. He was hounded and pressured as he went from town to town. He was falsely accused of things. He was financially struggling. In Matthew 8:20, his own family thought he was nuts. He was misunderstood by his closest friends. And that serves as an important reminder that no matter what is going on, or what we're going through, no matter what our circumstances look like, they don't have to result in worry. They don't have to result in worry. The Apostle Paul, whilst in prison, wrote this to the Philippians. He says, "Do not be anxious about anything." So the reality is worry doesn't always come from outside problems. Worry comes from within us. And if we're going to defeat this generosity killer, the first thing we need to understand is that worry is often on the inside. Well, you might think, well, I've got good reason to worry. I've got good reason to be concerned about things right now. You know, you don't understand the pressure that I'm under. You know, I have good reason to worry. But I think what Jesus' challenge to us is that you have no reason to worry. You have no reason to worry. But the truth is, not worrying doesn't mean our circumstances aren't hard. It doesn't mean that some of you are facing incredibly difficult challenges right now. Yet worrying about them, according to Jesus, is actually a choice. Just as we can choose to believe that God is in control and he will provide for our needs. And so worrying is one of the greatest generosity killers. When we're afraid about our own future and whether we will have enough, we will struggle to open our hands in generosity. So how do we become more generous? How do we face these generosity killers? Well, the number one thing I think we need to remember is that everything belongs to God. Everything belongs to God. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Some translations say, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." God owns your job. He owns your home, your car. Doesn't even belong to the lease company. Your body, your spouse, your children, your grandchildren. God owns everything. Everything that you have is good and it's God's good gift to you, but God owns it. And the problem that we have is that we don't understand that everything that we have, including our own lives, is on loan to us from him. So how do we become generous with our stuff? It's by reminding ourselves that God is the owner of everything. And we are simply stewards of what belongs to him. It all belongs to him anyway. And we're simply called to steward our time. We're simply called to steward our talents and steward our resources. And the scriptures teach us that as stewards, we are to receive all that God gives us and in turn offer the first fruits of what we receive back to him. Now, this could easily be a time. This could easily be your time. It could be your energy. It could be your money. And why does God invite us to do that? Why does he invite us to give our first fruits back to him? Well, Deuteronomy 14:24, it says this: the purpose of tithing, which is just a religious word for giving, the purpose of tithing is to teach you always to put God first in your life. I remember I read that and I was like a little bit surprised, because what I'd been taught in church was the purpose for tithing is because God needs your money. But that's not the case, is it? God doesn't need your money. If God wanted your money, he'd take it. God doesn't need your money. The purpose of giving is to teach us to put God first in our lives. It teaches us what is the most important thing. By taking the first part of what we have, the thing that's most important to us, and we say, God, this belongs to you. God, we want to honor you with all that you've blessed us with. So this is church. And we want to be a generous church. But we can only be a generous church because we are generous people. And we only get to show generosity to the world around us because we, as people, choose to be generous with what we have, our time, our energy, and our resources. And, being a person and a church who is generous with what we have, I think is an adventure. It's an adventure, and it's a thing that we discover over time is a really good deal. It's a good deal. You see, when we give, we're saying, God, I'm giving you this, trusting you for the rest. And we're called to do that in every season of our lives. We're called to do that whether we're married or single. We're called to do that when we have a little, when we have a lot. We're called to do that when we're raising babies, when we've got teenagers. We're called to do that when we've got an empty nest. Whatever season we find ourselves in, we're invited to give back to God. And this is the only area in the scriptures where God says, test me in this. Malachi 3:10, he says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will be not enough room to store it. So how might we respond today with 2 minutes to go? Well, maybe a next step from today for some of us is to address the generosity killers in our lives. Maybe some of us are struggling with debt. Maybe some of us have we know that there's some elements of our income and expenditure that we just need to get right. And we need to kind of figure out a new way of putting that right. We would love to signpost you to get the help that you might need. Maybe some of us sit here and we know that we carry worry and stress and fear in our bodies when it comes to this area of our lives. And maybe a next step for you this morning is to just come alongside some others and say, hey, I need help. I need the Lord to come and do something. I need you to pray with me. I need you to hold me accountable. I need to figure out what it means to not worry in the way that I carry it in these situations. Maybe for others of us, there's a practical next step to practice generosity consistently. And we don't teach that there is a particular amount that someone should give, okay? The Old Testament talks about a tithe, a tenth. Jesus seems to talk about 100%. So, you could take what you want, but, we don't dictate what someone should give. The Apostle Paul says that each person should determine what to give in their own hearts and do that hilariously, do that cheerfully. But maybe, at best, you would call yourself a sporadic giver. You give every now and again, but it's not in a planned way, and it's not in a kind of determined way. It's just often in the moment. What would it look like as a next step this morning for you to go from being a sporadic giver to an intentional giver? To bring your budget and your income before the Lord and say, Lord, how would you have me give? How would you have me honor you with the first fruits of what I have? How could I be intentional with all that you've given me, and how can I give back to you? Maybe that's the next step for you. And again, if you want some help with that, as I say, we're not going to tell you what to give. We're not going to, insist on a certain percentage or a certain amount. Here's the thing. The 10% thing is a bit of a soapbox for me. But, 10%, if 10% is the standard, the issue I have is that is oppressive for the poor and it's a get-out clause for the rich. Yeah? If you earn a small amount of money, 10% is a significant thing to give away, isn't it? But if you earn more than enough, 10%, good for you. And so we don't hear me say that we're after a certain amount or a certain amount of income or anything like that. It's about our hearts. It's about a heart surrendered to God. And so if you would like to chat about that, we'd love to kind of give you some tips and help you think about what does that look like? How do we do that as a community here at Garden City? So as we think about all of that, why don't we stand and we'll quickly pray.